everyone, welcome to B.Ed. Today I have brought before you another video for an English lesson plan of class 8, and the name of the chapter is The Squirrel. If you're new to my channel, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. So without any further ado, let's dive into the video. So the beginning of any lesson plan starts with a section called the identification of data, and here we have to put in some details like the name of the school, class, number of students, the duration of the class, subject, the name of the lesson, name of the textbook, and your own name. Next we write the general objectives. So the first one that I've written here is to enable the students to understand spoken English. Number 2, to enable the students to speak English correctly with correct pronunciation and stress. Number 3, to enable the students to read English correctly. Number 4, to enable the students to write English correctly. Number 5, to enable the students to know the structure of grammar. Number 6, to enable the students to develop their creativity and power of imagination. So these were the general objectives. The next section we have is called the teaching aids. So for teaching aids, we have to mention two types of teaching aids. The first one is general teaching aids, and the second one, specific teaching aids. So for general teaching aids, you can write blackboard, chalk, duster, pointer, textbook. And for specific teaching aids, I have written a chart showing the main parts of the lesson. After we are done with the teaching aids, we come to the next section, which is called the introduction. So for this section, you have to make 4 columns. One for step, one for assume previous knowledge, one for teacher's activity, and one for pupil's activity. So under the first column, which is for step, I have just written introduction in a vertical manner. The next column is assumed previous knowledge, and under this column I have written it is assumed that the pupils have some previous knowledge about the topic. The next column is the teacher's activity, and here I have written after entering the classroom, the teacher will arrange the class properly, and then in order to motivate the students, the teacher will ask some questions to them. The next column is for pupils' activity, and here you can write students will try to give the answers to the question. So for the next point, you have to write the same thing again that you wrote for the first point under assume previous knowledge. That is, it is assumed that the pupils have some previous knowledge about the topic. Now under the column of teacher's activity, it's time that we introduce the questions. So the first question that I wrote is name some animals. The answer to this question is on the next column, which is pupils' activity. The answer is dog, cat, cow, etc. Let's go to question number 2. Name some small animals. And the answer is rabbit, tortoise, frog. Third question, name some animals that can climb trees. The answer is pandas, monkeys, leopards. Last but not the least, the fourth question is name an animal that can climb trees and are very fast. And the answer is squirrel. We are done with all the questions. So now the next section that we have to make is called the announcement of the topic. So what is this section about? So it's actually when you're teaching in class and you reach the introduction part where you start asking them questions and the students are trying to answer. So by the time they are able to give the correct answer, which also means is the name of the chapter, then you can announce the name of the chapter yourself. So that is why this section is called the announcement of the topic. In this section I have written the teacher will then announce the topic before the students in the class as open inverted comma. Now we are going to discuss the lesson the squirrel inverted comma close. The teacher will write the name of the topic on the blackboard and tell the students to open their respective books and notebooks. The next section is called the presentation, and here you have to make 6 columns. So the first column is step, then teaching point, then specific objectives, then teacher's activity, then pupils activity, and lastly learning outcomes. Under the column of step, you have to write presentation in a vertical manner like this. And under the column of teaching point, I have written about the author, which means when you are about to explain the chapter, you first mention the author. The next column is for specific objectives, and here I have written the students will know about the author. As you can see, the next column is for teacher's activity, but first I'm going to read out the column of pupils activity, because what I have written under the column of teacher's activity is incomplete on this page, and I'll have to get to the next page if you want to see the whole thing. So that is why it would be a little inconvenient for me. So right now let's focus on pupils activity. We will get to teacher's activity in a minute. So under pupils activity, I have written pupils will listen carefully, and under the column of learning outcomes, I have written pupils will be able to acquire some information about the author. Now we will go back to teacher's activity, and I'm going to read it out for you. Now the teacher will discuss about the author. Boers titled her first volume of poetry Twist o' Smoke after the pseudonym she used in college. Twist o' Smoke won the 1928 Yale Younger Poets Prize and was published by Yale University Press. Basically, you can just write any brief information about the author, and you can also search by yourself on the internet. So after you have mentioned the author, next we move on to model reading. When you're in class and you're just done with explaining the chapter, or maybe a part of it even, the next thing you can do is to make the students read the chapter. So this is why we have to write about model reading. Mind you that model reading here is under the column of teaching point. The next column is for specific objectives, the next for teacher's activity, the fifth one for pupils activity, and the last one for learning outcomes. So the specific objective for model reading is the students will be able to develop correct pronunciation and listening skills. The teacher's activity says the teacher will read the chapter. Pupils activity, pupils will listen carefully. And under learning outcome, you have to write pupils will be able to read the poem with correct pronunciation. The next point is loud reading, and under teaching points, I have written they will be able to read the chapter with correct pronunciation. So it's almost the same as the teaching point from model reading. The teacher's activity for loud reading is now the teacher will make 3 or 4 students to read the chapter loudly. The pupils activity says pupils will read the chapter loudly, and the learning outcome says they will be able to read the chapter with correct pronunciation. You see, almost the same. The next point is silent reading, and the specific objective for it is they will be able to read the chapter. The teacher's activity to this point is teachers will ask the pupils to read the chapter silently. The pupils activity is pupils will read silently, and the learning outcome is they will be able to develop silent reading habits. The next teaching point is word meanings, and its specific objective is the students will be able to know new words and their meanings. The teacher's activity says, now the teacher will write some different words and their meanings on the blackboard and ask the students to write them on their copies. So here you have to insert some new words and their meanings. So the first word I wrote is war, and the meaning is put on. The next word is overcoat, which means a long thick coat worn in cold weather. The next word is grey, G-R-A-Y, grey, or grey, G-R-E-Y. It means a color between black and white. For example, dark grey, light grey, or pale grey. So after you are done with making the students read and introducing them to some new words, the next thing we have to do is explaining the chapter. So accordingly, the next point is explanation. So the specific objective for this teaching point is pupils will be able to know the theme of the chapter. Like I did previously, I will be reading the column of teaching activity later, but first let's skip to pupils activity. So the pupils activity is the students will listen attentively, and the learning outcome is they will be able to know the theme of the lesson. Now let's get back to teaching activity. It says, now the teacher will explain the theme of the poem. It is a poem that describes the look and the mannerism of a squirrel. The squirrel loves nuts and it always sits upright while consuming one. Moreover, it also likes to play with the nuts. Since squirrels are easily startled and are quick to move, it is quite difficult to approach them. So when the poet and her friends ran around where the squirrel lived, it always made a point to disappear through the other way. The next teaching point is questioning, and its specific objective is the students will be able to give answers. Under the column of teachers activity, I wrote, now the teachers will ask a few questions to evaluate the students. So this means while you are explaining in class and then you reach a point where you have to ask questions to the students, you can ask these questions. So the first question, which is written in the column of teachers activity, is who is the author of the squirrel? And its answer is written under the column of pupils activity, which is Mildred Bowers Armstrong. And under the column of learning outcomes, I have written students will be able to recall. The second question is, why does the poet say the squirrel wore a question mark for tail? And the answer is, the poet said the squirrel wore a question mark for tail because its tail is twisted, appearing like a question mark. The third question is, what is being compared to a grey overcoat? The answer is, the squirrel's body is being compared to a grey overcoat. Fourth question, what did the squirrel do if someone came too close to his tree? The answer is, the squirrel would run away in the opposite direction. Finally, we come to the last section of the lesson plan, which is known as the closure. For this section, you only have 3 columns, so one for step, one for teacher's activity, and the other one for pupils activity. So this section, which is known as the closure, it is for the part where you summarize the entire chapter and bring a close to it. Please write closure in a vertical manner under the column of step. And what you have to write under the column of teacher's activity, let me read it out for you. The teacher will briefly summarize the poem and write the main parts on the blackboard. The poem tries to describe a squirrel that the poet observes in his garden. The poet describes how the squirrel is covered in grey fur, sits in an upright position on a tree branch eating a nut. His tail looks like a question mark because of its bent shape. The happy and lively squirrel loves to play with the poet and her friends. Whenever they ran around his tree, he would run to the other side of the tree. The poet tells us about the nature of the squirrel, that it is innocently naughty and likes to tease anyone who comes near him. As for pupils' activity, it is pupils will listen carefully and try to answer the questions. After we are done summarizing the chapter, the next thing we do is ask some questions to the students. So I have mentioned some questions here. The first one is, what did the squirrel like? And please remember, this question has to be written under teacher's activity. Its answer should be under the column of pupils activity, which is, the squirrel likes to eat nuts. The second question is, what mark did the squirrel wear? And the answer is, the squirrel wore a question mark for a tail because its tail is twisted, appearing like a question mark. So now that all the questions and answers are over, we come to the next point, which is homework. So it means after summarizing the chapter and asking questions, the teacher is supposed to give homework to the students. So just write the next point, which is homework. And then I have written, now the teacher will give homework to the students. This is written under the column of teacher's activity. And under the column of pupils activity, it's written, pupils will note down the homework in their notebooks. Now let's mention the homework, which is, why does the squirrel run the other way when the poet runs around the tree? That was the homework there. So we are done with our lesson plan, except there's one last thing that needs to be mentioned, and that is after thanking the class, the teacher will clean the blackboard and leave the classroom. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel. I'll be back with a new lesson plan video very soon. Until then, take care. I'll see you next time.